Are there any mainstream scientific beliefs that you do not accept? For example, skepticism. It's a similarly fuzzy line as that between pseudoscience and legitimate science. There is a continuum, in fact, between these two extremes, with only a very fuzzy border in between. But also like pseudoscience, there are a number of behaviors that characterize denialism. The more of these behaviors one is engaging in, the more towards the denialism end of the spectrum they are. Whereas the more legitimate scientific processes one engages in, the more legitimate skepticism one is engaged in. Of course, everyone thinks that they are the true skeptics, that they are in the middle of this continuum right where they should be, skeptical to just the right degree. Anyone, therefore, who believes something that I do not, I can consider a true believer. And anyone who rejects a belief that I find plausible and true is a denier. It's natural to use ourselves as the touchstone or as the anchoring point, the calibration reference for true scientific skepticism. Therefore, deniers often portray themselves They then move the goalpost by changing the definition of what a transitional fossil is. Now they say, well, it's more than just being morphologically intermediate. They demand a separate line of evidence that proves that Ambulocetus is an actual ancestor to modern whales. This is related to another denialist strategy called the unreasonable demand for evidence. So as new evidence comes in, you can always nudge back the goalpost, keeping just out of range of whatever evidence is provided. But you can also simply begin by making a demand for evidence that you know can never be provided. No science is established down to every tiniest possible detail. Nothing in science is known to 100%. There are always gaps in our knowledge, gaps in our current understanding. Even the most solid theory has these gaps. The presence of incomplete knowledge or gaps in our knowledge, therefore, does not necessarily call into question a specific scientific theory or claim. What we do know may still be very well established. HIV denial is an excellent example of the unreasonable demand for evidence. Deniers often demand to see, for example, a single study or paper that establishes that HIV causes AIDS. However, the role of HIV in AIDS is a complex scientific question. It's not established by any one piece of evidence or any one research paper. So you can't point to one paper that proves HIV causes AIDS. That is a demand for evidence that nobody could possibly meet. Rather, there's a large body of research, each providing one piece to the puzzle. Taken collectively, they provide a compelling picture of the notion that HIV causes AIDS. Evolution is a similar example in that evolution deniers may say, show me one fossil that proves that criteria. So because all scientific claims have gaps in knowledge, the presence or absence of gaps isn't a way of distinguishing a legitimate scientific theory or a robust, well-supported scientific theory from a shaky or false theory. A much better way is to ask, how has this theory been changing over time? A theory is a living, dynamic thing. It is a way in which we explain experiments, explain evidence, and make predictions about what further evidence and further observations we will be making. If a theory is onto something, if it's successful, then what we expect is, as we look at that theory and the evidence for it over time, we expect that the gaps will be shrinking, that some gaps will be filled, the gaps in our knowledge, and our knowledge will be deepening. This is a better understanding of whether or not a scientific theory is successful and legitimate. How is success more subtle, with greater explanatory power and precision? It is undeniably one of the most successful scientific theories ever developed. Psi research, on the other hand, or research into extrasensory perception, ESP, precognition, and those types of abilities, has not had the same history over the last 100 years. It has rather been going around in circles and not progressing at all. It has yet to develop a single repeatable experiment that demonstrates the existence of psi, let alone progressing beyond that to explaining how psi might work. It does not provide any predictive or explanatory power. It has not gained support from any other field of science. We have discovered nothing in neuroscience, for example, that makes psi phenomena more plausible or explains how they might work, nor has the notion of psi helped us to understand what we're finding in neuroscience. Maybe you might say I'm just being a psi denier, but I think a comparison between evolution and psi research is very illustrative of the difference between a legitimate, robust, successful scientific theory and a pseudoscience that is stuck in neutral and simply not able to progress or to get anywhere. tactic or strategy of denialism is to dismiss entire categories of accepted scientific evidence. For example, deniers may cite the logical fallacy of confusing correlation with causation. Remember, I discussed this in a previous lecture, that we cannot assume that because two things are correlated, that therefore one causes the other. It's possible, for example, you can't assume A causes B. Maybe B causes A, or maybe some other third thing, C, causes both A and B. So therefore, it is true that the assumption of causation from correlation is a logical fallacy. That does not mean that we can dismiss all evidence of correlation. Correlation still is evidence. We can, for example, use multiple different types of correlation in order to make very high probability inferences about a causal connection. Otherwise, the entire field of epidemiology, the study of disease incidence and the pattern of diseases that occur in the world and in the community, would go away. It would be worthless if correlation was of no further predictions can be tested. For example, if smoking causes cancer, is not just correlated but actually causes cancer, statistically, smokers will begin smoking before it is likely that the cancer has developed. The duration of smoking will correlate with the increased risk. And smoking unfiltered cigarettes will have a higher risk than smoking filtered cigarettes. Further, quitting smoking will reduce cancer risk over time. All of those predictions flow from the hypothesis that the correlation between smoking and cancer is due to the fact that smoking causes certain kinds of cancer. All of those predictions have turned out to be true. In other words, multiple correlations can be used to triangulate onto the one specific causal relationship that is resulting in the observed correlation. And you cannot dismiss correlation as an entire category of scientific evidence. But the tobacco industry did just that in a deliberate campaign to sow doubt and confusion about the scientific evidence linking smoking to lung cancer. Evolution deniers use a similar strategy to deny that any historical science can be truly a science. They argue that since no one However, it wasn't also used to kill inmates. Further, humans are much more sensitive to cyanide than lice. It takes about 100 times as much cyanide to kill lice than it does a human. Therefore, we would expect the delousing chambers to have a higher concentration of cyanide residue than the chambers that were used to kill humans. The cyanide residue further washed off those walls in the ruins of these camps that were exposed to the elements for years. Walls that were less exposed contain cyanide residue consistent with their use as gas chambers. And none of this addresses the other lines of evidence for the use of Zyklon B in the gas chambers, evidence from documents and from eyewitness testimony, for example. So that's a good example of how you can collect together what I call factoids, little facts taken out of context, to build any picture that you wish to build, rather than digging deeply and putting each fact into its proper context in order for a more consistent or reliable picture to emerge. In the end, the goal of denial is to sow doubt and confusion. This is done by pointing out apparent inconsistencies, current gaps in knowledge, sometimes to legitimate dissent. Just because an argument is legitimate doesn't mean that it can't be marshaled for illegitimate or pseudoscientific purposes. And also, the campaign of doubt and confusion exploits the messiness of science. There's always contradictory data and false starts, blind alleys. You can point to this messiness in order to, again, cast a sinister eye onto a legitimate claim and make it seem in doubt. Scientists make mistakes all the time. They pursue dead ends. They use bad arguments and evidence. And sometimes they even commit fraud. That doesn't mean that the entire enterprise, however, or any specific claim is wrong. At the end of the day, you have to just objectively look at the evidence. It is therefore easy to find ways to call any scientific claim into doubt, if that's your goal. Healthy skepticism, on the other hand, fairly considers all the evidence and puts it into a proper perspective. Critical thinking. It acknowledges that all knowledge is incomplete, that scientists are imperfect people, but we can still come to reliable conclusions with sufficient evidence. Deniers often combine their program of doubt with the false dichotomy. I mentioned this specifically with the conspiracy theories in the previous. Evidence itself is all a fraud, a grand conspiracy, usually of their ideological opponents. This allows them to dismiss all that pesky evidence, all the published studies that prove that the science they do not want to acknowledge. In the end, denial is just another form of pseudoscientific thinking. Deniers violate multiple principles of critical thinking, logic, and scientific methodology because of their a priori beliefs. By studying the tactics of deniers, we also learn to recognize the more subtle versions that we engage in every day. Generally, we resist changing our beliefs. The psychological studies show that we marshal a lot of cognitive energy in order to maintain what we already believe and what we want to believe. A little bit of motivated denial can save us from a lot of cognitive dissonance, unless we deliberately engage our learned critical thinking skills.